with Monday's Newsnight.
Nigel Farage says he wants to be a candidate for Prime Minister in 5 years' time. Right now, his party is promising to cut the NHS England waiting list to 0 in 2 years. How is that possible? And the two-child benefit cap, which both the Conservatives and Labour will keep, will plunge 500,000 more children into relative poverty, according to new figures. Hello, welcome to Newsnight, where I hope you know by now we bring you interviews and election insight live every weeknight. Our political panel tonight, Conservative peer Lord Ed Vaizey and the boss of electricity company Ecotricity, Dale Vince, who will support Labour at this election. In the past, he has donated money to Labour, the Greens and the Lib Dems. We'll hear from them both in a moment. First, Nick, take our audience through the launch of the contract Nigel Farage announced regarding Reform UK's plans.
Well, as you say, Vic, the key word is contract. Nigel Farage is saying it's not a manifesto because he says manifestos are associated with the established parties, and he said they lie. So what are they trying to do? Two big aims. Firstly, saying what they would do, and in secondly, in highlighting their aims that show how the two main parties, Labour and the Conservatives, in their eyes have failed. So what are the top three items? Immigration, there it is. Freeze non-essential immigration, stop the boats by leaving the European Convention on Human Rights. Second idea, slash government spending, wasteful government spending, identifying £91 billion in savings. Idea number three, big tax cuts. You won't start paying income tax until you earn £20,000 a year. Important to say that the Institute for Fiscal Studies is raising some pretty big questions about the sums of Reform UK. Now, what is Nigel Farage talking about? He's not talking about being Prime Minister. He said Keir Starmer is going to be Prime Minister at the end of this election. What Nigel Farage is talking about is forming a bridgehead in opposition, creating a big national movement, as he calls it, so he can vie for Prime Minister in 2029. He knows his best hope for Reform UK is to get a handful of MPs in this election. The bigger aim is to smash the Conservative Party to such an extent that the Conservative Party would turn to him, Nigel Farage, as their saviour. The idea after that is not that Nigel Farage turns to the Conservative Party, it's the Conservative Party turns to Nigel Farage.
And why did they launch in Merthyr Tydfil?
Well, the big message they want to get across is that Reform UK, in their view, doesn't just take votes from the Conservative Party, it takes it from the Labour Party. So go to Wales. As Nigel Farage said, Wales has had a continuous Labour government since 1997. Before devolution, it was the UK government. Since devolution, it has been the Labour-devolved administration. Important to say that his predecessor party, the Brexit Party, came second in the nearby neighbouring old seat of Blaenau Gwent in 2019. We've just mentioned two areas, so let's mention the names of their seats as they are. So it's Merthyr Tydfil and Aberdare. That's where they launched the manifesto. That previous seat I was talking about, the new one is Blaenau Gwent and Rhymney. If you want to see the full list of candidates for those seats, you can go to the BBC website.
Thank you. And here is Mr Farage speaking at his contract launch this afternoon.
And we want to have an absolutely radical rethink of the way in which our public services are run. And yes, that does include the National Health Service. It's been very, very difficult to have any conversation about the NHS over the course of the 25 years that I've been involved in politics without someone pointing and screaming, you want to privatise it. All we want is an NHS that is free at the point of delivery that actually works. And how we get there, frankly, I don't think most people could give a damn about.
Well, let's talk to the Deputy Leader of Reform UK, Ben Habib. Thank you for talking to our audience on Newsnight.
Good evening.
Your promise to wipe out the 7.5 million cases on the NHS waiting list in England in 2 years, taking it to 0. Can you explain to our audience how?
Yeah, so the principal mechanism by which we would do that is to offer tax relief at the basic rate of tax for 3 years to all frontline staff, and that would incentivise frontline staff to actually stay in their jobs. And, you know, over the last year, 15 to 20,000 doctors have actually left the NHS. You can't. It's like trying to fill a bath which has got a hole in it. You know, you can't.
How does that bring the waiting list to zero?
Well, if you have more frontline staff, you deal with the waiting list more efficiently. So that's one of the things. The other thing is to use the non-profit sector of the medical fraternity to treat those people who can't be treated in the NHS. And there's a lot of available capacity doing that. And we've got other policies as well, for example, forgiving student debt for those students who stay in the NHS for up to 10 years. Every year they would have a proportion of their student debt forgiven. That's a more long-term policy. And the fourth policy, which I was absolutely amazed to find when I first discovered this, that there's actually a cap in the UK on how many nurses and doctors we can train each year, and we would remove that cap. So it's a function, it's a multiplicity of things that we would do. Some more medium to long term. That doesn't get you to taking the waiting list in England from 7.57 million to zero in 2 years, does it? Well, I tell you what doesn't get you there.
Well, why don't you answer that question first?
What doesn't get you there is doing precisely what the government is doing, which is doing nothing about it.
So the real issue... No. The real question I'm asking you is that doesn't get you from over 7.5 million cases to zero in 2 years,
if you're losing 15 to 20,000 doctors a year because they're not paid enough, because they're not taking home enough pay, you cannot tackle the waiting list.
Okay.
What you've got to do is make it pay for nurses and doctors. You know, we all stood on the streets clapping the NHS.
We did.
But what we didn't do was actually give the NHS frontline staff what they deserve, which is a fair wage.
If only it was that simple. This is what the health think tank, the King's Fund, say.
Yeah.
Many staff work both in the private sector and the NHS. And I know you talk about using spare capacity in the private sector, although you haven't mentioned it this evening, which is interesting. They say private sector capacity is scarce. Just because a patient can't be seen on the NHS doesn't mean the private sector has the capacity to see them.
I tell you what, when I want a private medical appointment, I have no problem getting one.
Right.
It's the NHS that is under pressure.
Do you not believe the think tank, the health think tank, the King's Fund, when they say spare capacity in the private sector is scarce?
Is this think tank advocating that you take no steps towards addressing the fundamental shortage? Is that what they're saying?
I'm asking you a question.
No, but the point is...
Rather than you asking me a question.
Well, no, because what you're saying... And I find this discourse in politics and public policy making...
What, testing your policies?
No, not that. The discourse that every journey is so demanding that you never take a step towards challenging the task at hand. The point is, what they're trying to say is you can't deal with it. What we're trying to say is what we will do is stem the outflow of frontline staff from the NHS. We will deliver more staff back into the front line of NHS staff.
Let me speak now,
if you can do both those things, you will treat the causes of illness. The other thing, by the way, the other elephant in the room is immigration. Is immigration.
No, I'm going to pause you because I'm asking the questions, if that's OK.
Yeah, but you're not letting me answer. So
I really am. You keep answering with a question back. So let me put this to you. According to my maths, in order to get to zero, and you believe me, people would love it if you could get to zero in 2 years. I'm asking you whether it's realistic. It would be 73,000 cases being dealt with every week when there isn't the capacity, the hospital beds, and according to the IFS, the money that you're promising, 17 billion a year, is not nearly enough, their words, to eliminate the waiting list.
17 billion comes in tax relief. The other thing that we would do...
It's not enough.
The other thing that we would do is cut back immigration dramatically. And we've had a massive burden put on all public services, including the NHS, as a result of the rampant immigration that we've had over the last 5 years.
But you wouldn't cut back on immigrants who work in the NHS or social care, correct?
Well, what we are doing is proposing a tax on people, on employers, an additional 6.2% increase in national insurance on employers who employ foreign workers, with the exception of those who work in the NHS and social care.
You also want, in your manifesto, what you call a patriotic curriculum in primary and secondary schools. What is that?
Well, a curriculum which doesn't teach children that their forefathers were all slave traders, that teaches them the truth about British history, of which we should be proud, that we had a fantastic empire, that English language was exported to the great betterment of the world across the world, that we exported our common law system, that all the technology and infrastructure and all the capability that we produced through the Industrial Revolution was also exported for the betterment of other people.
Sure.
So that's a starting point.
Can I ask
getting
you,
rid of the notion,
getting
rid of the notion that the English language needs to be decolonised, which is something that seems to be established in tertiary and secondary education.
Okay.
Absolute nonsense. Getting rid of critical race theory, which teaches our children that actually somehow if you're white and you don't recognise your privilege, you're racist. That is all got to be ditched, including, while I'm at it, transgender ideology being taught to children in school.
Let's stick with history. So are you saying that shameful episodes in Britain's past would get taught or not?
No, you can teach shameful episodes, but it's got to be done in context. I went to speak at the sixth form of a sixth form politics class when I was standing in the by-election in Wellingborough a few months ago, and I asked for a show of hands on who thought the national wealth of Great Britain, of the United Kingdom, was born out of the slave trade, and 2/3 of hands went up. And it is an absolute false notion. This country shut down the slave trade and spent a lot of money, including human lives, shutting it down across the globe. And that isn't taught. And we've got to stand up for the United Kingdom. And we've got to teach our children to be proud of the United Kingdom, for which they should rightly be.
If I can use the words from the manifesto launch today, our children must be taught about their heritage. Their heritage. Which children are you talking about?
The heritage that I've just talked about.
Which particular
If you're a British citizen, your heritage is the history of the British Isles. That is your heritage.
Including the history of the British Empire.
Including the history of the British Empire, of which we should largely be proud, and the fantastic contribution that we've made to the globe over the last 200 or 300 years, including standing alone against Nazi Germany. St Paul's Cathedral had Winston Churchill down as a white supremacist on their website until a few months ago, until people like me shouted about it. It is an absolute affront to our cultural context that you could class Winston Churchill as anything other than a national hero.
OK. That was in St Paul's Cathedral. Nothing to do with what's being taught in state schools in history lessons.
That is what is happening institutionally across the United Kingdom.
I'm going to put this quote to you, if I may. David Olusoga, British historian. I asked him for his reaction to what you'd written in your manifesto. He said this to me: "Striving for balance in history is illiterate. This is not economics. This is about fomenting divisions in order to win votes."
Absolute garbage. I tell you what foments division. It is the so-called notion of diversity, equality and inclusion, which is the regulatory and legal framework that government has put in place in order to champion and celebrate ethnic minorities, religious minorities and transgender ideology and all that sort of thing over and above, and largely to the detriment of the majority of the people in this country. It is a kind of form of reverse racism. That's the kind of thing that needs to be got rid of. We would get rid of DEI, and what we would require is that all people are recognised to be equal.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ben Habib, who is the Deputy Leader of Reform. Nick, those kind of policies, who will they appeal to, do you reckon?
Well, I mean, they're well-known policies. Many of them are controversial, and they seem to be sort of striking a chord with some voters, because the Reform UK vote, well, it's clearly ticking up across a number of opinion polls. And interestingly, later this week, we are going to see that Boris Johnson will be sending out a direct mail shot that will be landing on doormats later this week. This will be perceived as an attempt by a nervous Conservative Party to get all those people who are thinking of reform to come back to the Conservatives. I think the view in the Boris Johnson campaign is this mail shot was long planned and he's doing his bit to support this campaign.
Ed Vaizey, you're friends with Boris Johnson, aren't you?
Well, I mean, I like Boris Johnson. I don't know if he'd call,
will it help?
I don't know if he'd call me a friend of his. But
OK.
Yes, I think it will help. I think Boris, whatever you think of him, whatever you think of what happened to Boris when he was Prime Minister, is electoral gold. I mean, the counterfactual to what we're going through in this election now is if Boris was still Prime Minister, would the Tories be having a fighting chance? I mean, there is something about Boris. People do love him, particularly.
Do you think people have forgotten?
Particularly people who.
Do you think people have forgotten the lies over Partygate, the illegal social gatherings that were going on in and around Downing Street?
I think Boris has a reach, particularly with what you would call natural Conservative voters.
But that was
people who
before
might
Partygate.
the people who might be debating now whether they want to support the Conservative Party at the election. Boris reaches out to them. I just think that's a fact. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I just think that is a fact.
Is Nigel Farage more Conservative than Conservatives?
That's a good question. No, I don't think he is. I think he's sort of... I think he's a populist, and I don't think that's what Conservatives is about. I mean,
raising the personal tax threshold to 20k, freezing non-essential immigration, replacing the ECHR with a Bill of Rights.
Nigel Farage is not a socialist, but I don't think he's a Conservative. I don't think he's a populist. I think he's a populist. I think governments win from the centre, political parties win from the centre. That's what I fought for the Conservatives to do after the 97 defeat. If we're defeated at this election, that's what I'll fight for the Conservatives to do this time around. We have to stay in the centre ground to win. Populists do not win.
Dale Vince, Nigel Farage said Reform would scrap the net zero targets to save 30 billion a year. And Rishi Sunak today was attacking Labour and its costly net zero policies. What do you think?
I think they both talk nonsense about net zero. I think they don't understand the topic. I don't think they care to understand the topic. I think they're trying to find votes and cheap politics in this issue.
Well, if you look at voters across Europe in the European elections recently, there has been, maybe you would even concede, a backlash against the Greens in various European nations.
I think there's been an uptick in right-wing votes. I think that's a fact. I don't think that is a judgment on net zero. I think if you look at the...
So fewer people voting for the Greens is a judgment on what, if it's not a judgment on net zero?
I don't know. But if you look at the economics behind net zero, there's no rationale, there's no logic in saying that it's expensive and we can't afford it. Because for every pound we spend on renewable energy, we get 2.5 times more jobs and twice the GDP growth that we get if we spend that same pound on fossil fuels. That's a fact.
Right. What do you think regarding net zero? We remember David Cameron when he was the leader. Well, I mean, there were contradictory things. He talked about cutting the green crap at one point, didn't he?
I think net zero is a win-win. I understand in terms of the transition how people will want to use this as a wedge issue. I mean, we had a brilliant...
Rishi Sunak's pushback target dates as well.
The Tories had a brilliant MP in Robert Halfon who got the government to freeze fuel duty for 10 years, which was not a net zero policy. I support the low emission zone in London. I think Sadiq Khan makes a very good case about the quality of London's air. It's expensive to get from where we are to where we need to be, but it's a win-win in terms of the technology, in terms of giving Britain leadership in this technology, and in terms of saving lives.
And the OBR have said it will cost our economy twice as much to stick with fossil fuels as to transition to green energy. They said this about 4 months ago in a report to Rishi Sunak.
What about the cost to consumers right now over the next 5 years, over the next 10 years?
There should be no cost.
But that's just not true, is it?
What
does a heat pump cost? 7 grand, 10 grand?
I'm not advocating heat pumps. I'm advocating green energy from the wind and the sun.
And what if there isn't enough wind and sun energy?
Well, but there is. There are ways we can sort this by having an overcapacity of green generation and the smart grid in combination, which is about how we use energy at different times of the day in a very smart way. But heat pumps are about how we decarbonise home heating. It's a very different thing. And we have an answer for that as well. We can make the gas we need from grass, and we have an abundance of grass in our country. We have enough grass to make all of the gas that we need.
OK. We'll be back with you shortly.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Right, we're going to talk next about the two-child benefit cap, which both the Conservatives and Labour say they would keep, and the Greens and Lib Dems have pledged to remove. Well, according to new figures out today, it will plunge 500,000 more children into relative poverty over the next Parliament. Labour's manifesto commits to a child poverty strategy, but not to lifting the cap. Last week, I asked their Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Darren Jones, about this. You even have Suella Braverman calling for the cap to be abolished. And Nigel Farage, it would seem, on the ITV debate tonight. Yet you, Labour, won't promise to do that.
Well, that's because the difference between the Conservatives and Reform and Labour is that our policies are fully funded and fully costed. That has to be what people expect from any party trying to form the government at this election. And look, would I like the economy to be in a better position? Of course I would. Would I like a Labour government to be coming into a country where we've got plenty of tax revenues to be able to spend on all the things that we would like to do as the Labour movement? Of course I would. But the fact of the matter is that we will inherit the worst financial situation that any party has inherited since the Second World War. We're going to have to do the hard yards to turn that around, and that means that yes, we've got those 6 steps that we want to get started with immediately, but it will take some time to turn the country around. I think people at home recognise the fact that we can't just click our finger and change that immediately on day one. But our plan for change today and our manifesto sets out how we're going to do that.
Yeah, I'm sure voters do recognise that, and they may also recognise that you are making a choice. You could fully fund and fully cost lifting the two-child benefit cap, and you are making the choice not to do that. That's right, isn't it?
Well, these are trade-offs. We've made the commitment not to increase taxes because the tax burden is already too high on people as a consequence of the Conservative record in government. That means that there's not then additional revenue to pay for some of our additional priorities. But these are the trade-offs that any party has to make if they want to be in government.
Well, let's talk now to the Institute for Fiscal Studies' Tom Waters. Thank you very much for being with us. And you have produced this graph, which we're going to show our audience straight away. And I wonder if you could just talk us through it, please.
So what we're looking at here is the fraction of children that are in poverty. This is using the government's official relative poverty definition over time. Well, you can see if you look at the middle grey line, the overall rate of child poverty has been fairly stable for quite a while. But for those in smaller families, those with 2 or fewer children, the red line there, you can see it's starting to decrease, but that's basically being offset by bigger families. That green line, you can see the fraction of children in bigger families who are in poverty, that's been steadily rising and is now about 46%.
And that will continue to rise into the next Parliament with it being kept by Labour and the Tories.
So the 2-child limit, it certainly has a really big impact on bigger families and does tend to push some families into poverty, yes.
And so what would happen if you lifted that 2-child benefit cap?
So that would have a pretty immediate material impact on the families that are currently being affected by the policy. At the moment, it's about 2 million children or so, and on average, they lose something in the order of 10% of their income because of the policy. And so that would be a pretty immediate effect on their incomes and would pull a substantial fraction of them out of poverty.
And what is 10% in terms of pounds and pence?
Something like £4,300 a year.
Really? OK. Which is a significant sum.
Absolutely.
For anybody. Thank you very much, Tom Waters from the Institute for Fiscal Studies. And Nick, what was the rationale in the first place for the Conservatives bringing this cap in?
Well, in a sense, the cap that was introduced, obviously, first introduced in the 2015 budget, is where the sort of Ian Duncan Smith approach of sort of remodelling the welfare system really met George Osborne's need for cuts at the height of the austerity. That was why it was introduced. And obviously, Keir Starmer has been talking about this today. Now, Keir Starmer Keir Starmer has previously talked about how he would like to get rid of this, but all the emphasis, as you saw from that interview you had with Darren Jones, is how they're not going to commit to that now because of what they talk about ironclad fiscal rules from Rachel Reeves. But interestingly, the Labour leader was talking about it today. He said, I'm not going to put a date on these things about when he might move, but then he said this, but I'm not immune from just how powerful an argument this is. A powerful argument that if you get rid of this, it's exactly what the IFS are talking about, you might help to alleviate child poverty.
Well, you would alleviate something like 11% of families overnight. Dale Vince, you're a Labour supporter. What do you think of the fact that at the moment Labour are keeping this, should they win this election?
Well, I think I understand where they're coming from, broadly throughout the election in terms of making spending pledges and things they can't be certain they can stick to on the other side of the election. I think and hope that on the other side of the election, if Labour win, they will look at this again and find it in their hearts and actually find it in, the nation's bank account to solve this problem, because I think it's a very cruel policy. It's pushed hundreds of thousands of kids and families into real poverty. And when we do that, it's perverse to our own economy, because we take away the life chances of young people and we make it harder for them to contribute to our economy. And of course, we rely on the next generation to pay for our aging population, of pensions and stuff like that. So, I mean, these are the people we rely on, and we're treating them terribly badly in their early life. And I don't think any of that makes sense.
Does it make sense to you, Lord Vasey?
Well, it was, as Nick said, part of George Osborne's welfare cuts. It was in the manifesto, excuse me, in 2015. He stuck to it.
And you voted for it.
And it included, in fact, foisting the pensioners' TV licence onto the BBC. And the BBC actually ended up sorting out the welfare policy for George Osborne and linked the free TV licence to the pension credit, was actually a much better policy, which the BBC came up with.
Why did you vote for the two-child benefit?
Well, because I voted for the budget and I voted for the manifesto that all Tory MPs stood on. But it is, Dale has a point about this, but the trouble is that, as he points out, the Labour Party have to stick to it because they have to stick to these spending plans that they've announced. But I didn't support, although I voted for it, the complications that have been put on some of these benefits, like child benefit as well, where there is now an unbelievably complicated system. It was a very simple system. Everyone who had a baby got child benefit. Now, if you have 2, 3, 4, depending on your income, your child benefit changes. It adds a lot of friction. So it would be simpler if you took out these complications and these kind of arbitrary cliff edges in the welfare system.
Right. We're going to have a look at some of tomorrow's front pages, I think, right now, and we're going to start with the Daily Telegraph. Tories turn to Johnson to counter reform. We reflected that in our conversation earlier. Front page of the Eye, Farage. It's impossible to know if reform would keep the low tax pledge. FT, French bosses build ties with Le Pen as the left triggers alarm. The Guardian, Farage accused of cut and spend manifesto that doesn't add up. And The Sun, Play Jude. Rishi and Keir urge the nation to back the ACES chant. And front page of the Daily Mail, Rishi, Keir only wants votes at 16 to entrench his power. What do you think of the votes for 16-year-olds that Labour would bring in, should they win?
Have they said they will? Have they?
Keir Starmer has, yeah.
Has he? Oh, great. I think it's a good idea. Up until yesterday, I thought it was something the Tories had said Labour would do and Labour had not said they would do.
Yeah.
But I think it's a good idea because 16-year-olds, they're engaged. They know what's happening in the world. I think we should give them the right to vote. They've got the right to do a lot of other things at the age of 16. Why not vote?
What if the Conservatives don't win this election and Rishi Sunak...
And it's a big if. Carry on.
Rishi Sunak is still saying today he's fighting for every vote, of course, whereas people like Grant Shapps, he's again suggesting it's not a likely outcome.
Yeah.
Those were his words today. Last week he warned about a supermajority. How long do you think you're looking at the Conservatives out of power for?
Well, it's a huge risk depending on the size of the Labour majority. And you saw what happened in 97. We were out of power for 3 elections. And I think if we do lose this election, it is very important indeed that the Conservative Party recognises where you win elections from. You don't go and say we didn't try proper conservatism hard enough. You recognise that there are lots of factors why the public may not have given you a 4th mandate. And you learn from that and you get straight back to talking to Britain as she is today, rather than the Britain you wish existed sort of 50 years ago, which is a myth anyway.
But it kind of depends if Labour wins, and the polls have been wrong before,
They have.
But it depends on which Tory MPs retain their seats as to what shape the party will be, yes?
That's right. I mean, when Keir Starmer was very carefully laying his plans to become leader of the Labour Party in the summer of 2019, i.e. before the general election, his team were working out various scenarios of how badly Labour was going to do under Jeremy Corbyn and what sort of Labour MPs there would be, because that was going to be the initial stage of the electorate. So, yes, you would need to be working out, if you're a Tory leadership hopeful, if the election doesn't go well, you are going to be thinking, how many One Nation Tories will be there? How many sort of ERG, European Research Group Conservatives will be there? Because obviously they will decide who are the 2 people that get onto the ballot, who then go to the membership.
Sure. Who would you like to see as the next leader of the Tory party? And I'm going to make you say a name.
Well, I think...
New generation, who could it be? Or maybe not new generation.
I would not be massively upset if Kemi Badenoch became leader of the Conservative Party after the next election.
Yes.
Well, I don't know what the choice would be. I mean, obviously, I'd want it to be Michael Gove, but he's not standing.
Right. Why would you want it to be him?
Because I can't get out of my head my constant support for Michael Gove as leader of the Tory party.
And of course, Michael Gove
but maybe he could do it
Kemi
from the
Badenoch.
Lords. Maybe he could do it from the Lords, Nick.
He could do it, or David Cameron could do it.
Since we're in sort of,
What about the return of David Cameron?
But it's a party without talent now.
Well, I think that's a bit mean, Dale, actually.
I think it's fundamentally the problem there.
I think there are actually some fantastic candidates coming up fighting in these elections, which I'm not going to name, obviously, because then trigger all sorts of election rules. In fact, I said to one of the candidates who might get elected in a couple of weeks' time, they should stand immediately.
For leader?
Yeah, they're so talented.
This is a newly
elected Conservative MP.
Person of a mature age, experience. Why not?
That's how low down the barrel the Tories
No, we don't. Look, listen, who knows which Tory MPs are going to be MPs after the election? I think the supermajority message is getting through. I think that there will be a narrowing of the polls closer to the election, but all of us have seen these polls. It's become the opinion poll election in many respects. The opinion polls get the headlines more than the policies do. There will be a range of different MPs. I think Kemi Badenoch is a strong candidate. It feels a bit weird calling out who should be leader of the Tory party before the election is even over. But if there were to be a leadership election after an election, which if the Tories had lost
Kemi
it...
Badenoch warm the seat for the return of your good friend Boris Johnson in the future as a future leader?
It's becoming a sort of pub-like conversation. I don't know.
You're a leading light in the
It's all such massive speculation. I mean, I think Boris is a great asset to the Tory party. We know the mistakes he made as Prime Minister, etc., etc. But I have no idea if Boris Johnson wants to be an MP again.
OK. Thank you both very much.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks, Nick. That's it from us tonight. Thank you for your company. I'm back tomorrow. See you then.
Good evening. The low pressure that brought the cool and disappointing weather story